On this episode of WarDocs, we're honored to speak with Air Force and Space Force Surgeon General, Lieutenant General John J. DeGoes, who shares his journey into Air Force medicine, discussing his motivations, unique training experiences, and the responsibilities of a flight surgeon. He reflects on the impact of 9/11 on military healthcare, the challenges faced as Central Command Surgeon, and innovations in Air Force medicine, particularly in aeromedical evacuation. General DeGoes discusses innovations in military medicine, the establishment of the Air Force Medical Command, and the complexities of leadership within a vast healthcare system. He emphasizes the importance of communication, strategic planning for future missions, and shares valuable leadership lessons for the next generation. For further information about Lieutenant General DeGoes and our previous guests, visit our website at wardocspodcast.com. Be sure to follow WarDocs on your preferred podcast platform and subscribe to our WarDocs YouTube channel. I'm your host, Dr. Doug Soderdahl, retired Army urologist, and I'm joined by Major General Retired Sean Murphy, former Chief of the Air Force Medical Corps.
Welcome to WarDocs, the military medicine podcast. This show brings you a first-hand, behind-the-scenes look into the mission, unique opportunities, and deployed experiences of the entire military healthcare team. From state-of-the-art hospitals in the United States to the most austere environments across the globe, WarDocs has you covered.
Today we're privileged to welcome Air Force and Space Force Surgeon General, Lieutenant General Dr. John J. DeGoes to WarDocs. Sir, thanks for joining us today.
Thanks for having me, Dr. Soderdahl.
JJ, we've known each other for a long time, but I've never asked you the question. What brought you into Air Force medicine and what led to the decision of going to USUHS?
Dr. Murphy, I always wanted to be a physician, really from kind of high school, growing up in Rhode Island, went to Boston College, and I didn't have any military background, but I did have some family, friends, fathers who were in the Rhode Island Air National Guard. And actually, it was probably serendipity that my father was involved with some politics in Rhode Island and knew Senator John Chafee from Rhode Island, who happened to say, hey, there's this medical school outside of DC called the Uniformed Services University. And not only is it free to go there, but they pay you as a second lieutenant. And so, I didn't know what to think at the time, but went for an interview, loved the campus, and was accepted. And really, that's kind of how it started.
So you trained in internal medicine and are also certified as a flight surgeon. How would you say that the medical training in the military compares to the civilian sector? And what are some of the unique opportunities in military medicine that you may not get in the private sector?
Yeah. So, when I was in San Antonio as a young internal medicine physician at Wilfred Hall, I had done training in the military with USU, my clerkships at all the military's biggest hospitals, was a staff at Wilfred Hall. And I kind of wondered, how good is my training? Am I as good as a civilian physician if I had gone to Georgetown and had private practice? And I kind of developed the impression after doing some moonlighting at pretty much all the hospitals in San Antonio in the early 90s that the medicine we practiced in the military and my training was really good, that in some ways I could run circles around some of the private practitioners that were in the big San Antonio hospitals. The other thing is the experience at Wilfred Hall Medical Center in the early 90s was really unique. 1,000-bed hospital built for the Cold War. It had a tremendous amount of complexity and diversity. It's a level 1 trauma center, had transplant wards, the only allogeneic transplant for bone marrow in the Air Force. And at that time, HIV was really an epidemic worldwide, and all people with HIV in the Air Force would come to Wilfred Hall. We had an entire ward of patients with AIDS, and this is before the introduction of AZT. And so there were, horrible opportunistic infections, things that were really unique. So unfortunately, in a way, it was a really unique and great training for somebody in internal medicine.
So, JJ, back in long ago, we were majors together at Keysler. You were running the whole ambulatory shop, and I was running the pediatric outpatient clinic. And back in those clinical days, we've had plenty of opportunity to see great clinical cases. What are some clinical cases that you might remember that our listeners might enjoy?
I had the opportunity to be a flight surgeon as a career broadening aspect. And during my first deployment in 2005, I served as the lead flight doc at an aeromedical staging facility in Kuwait that received patients frequently from Iraq, but occasionally from all over the Persian Gulf. And I was looking at a bunch of patients in a tent that we were about to load on a C-17 to send back to Germany on the way to the United States, and saw a young soldier, probably 20 years old, that was billed as sore throat, probable strep throat, and failure to thrive, who had got standard therapy but wasn't getting better. And to make a long story short, he just looked sicker than he was described. And when I evaluated him, he could barely lift his head, and he had kind of a rash on his face and his eyelids, and the back of his hands were red, and particularly his knuckles. And so, remembering back to Wilfred Hall and rheumatology training, this looked a lot like dermatomyositis. And the problem with that is that it's not just a derm issue, it's that your muscles can get really weak, and to include your respiratory muscles. And, really over the course of an hour in the tent, he's getting weaker and weaker. So I take some pictures of him. This is before digital cameras, but I put it onto the computer, and I send it back to Wilfred Hall, to my rheumatology faculty from 15 years earlier. And they were like, yeah, this is dermatomyositis. And so within a few minutes, I was pulsing him with 1,000 milligrams or a gram of solumedrol, and arguing with the theater validating flight surgeon whether or not we should intubate him or not prophylactically. And thankfully, cooler heads prevailed. We had a CCAT team watch him closely, didn't intubate him. And by the time he arrived at Germany, he was already starting to get stronger. And 2 days later, I got a call from the chief of rheumatology there, congratulating me on making a diagnosis of dermatomyositis in Kuwait. And so one of the takeaways for me is, the value of graduate medical education, the value of it in the military, and how you can reach back to military faculty members later in your career. And so I've used that story a few times speaking at residency graduations in the future, that I usually do it with confidence. And do you have enough confidence to ask a question, but that you're not overconfident that you just wing it? So thankfully, it worked out for this patient.
So you mentioned this happened while you were a flight surgeon. What exactly does a flight surgeon do in the Air Force? What kind of opportunities and responsibilities do you have?
In addition to flying, and you can fly in jets and heavy planes, big transport planes, they are the experts in the physiology and the human performance optimization of those flying the planes, those fixing the planes, certifying the planes. They are really our operational medicine experts, and even beyond the flying enterprise, the occupational health experts. So they're the ones that translate clinical situations and potential risk to mission and risk to the individual, and apply that to whatever the job is. So if you're driving fuel trucks on the flight line, and you had a seizure and you're on anti-seizure medicine, we need to weigh those risks. So they're really in charge of what we would call team aerospace. And so the public health, bioenvironmental engineering, and just kind of all of the profiling and duty limitation evaluation. So there's all kinds of opportunities for flight medicine in addition to taking care of flyers and their families. You can deploy. Some folks go to the South Pole for research things on C-130s on skis. So there's a tremendous opportunity for those that are interested in flight medicine.
JJ, 9/11 was impactful for many of us. Where were you during 9/11? And how did that kind of affect your Air Force career?
For September 11th, 2001, I was a father of 3-year-old triplets in San Antonio, and I was home on leave, actually. I was on the staff at Air Education and Training Command headquarters, and couldn't believe it as the first plane hit the Twin Towers and then the second plane. And the office called me and said, just stay home on leave. Randolph Air Force Base had gone into Delta lockdown completely. And, I had another 5 days of leave. It did not immediately affect me and my career being at Air Education and Training Command and not out in the combat air forces at the time. And there was no sudden deployment. But really, what I would say that 9/11 did was it influenced the Air Force medical service that I served in for really the last 25 years. We optimized the Air Force Medical Service to support the global war on terror. We were about 10 years past the fall of the Berlin Wall and the end of the Cold War. And we had air dominance, and it was largely a unipolar world. And our bases at home and even in deployed settings were sanctuaries where we had air dominance, that if you needed an air evac plane to come into Balad or Bagram, you could get it because there was air dominance and there wasn't a risk to the plane coming into those places because we controlled the skies. We were able to reduce the footprint of deployed medics in Iraq and Afghanistan, I think because of that air superiority. And we were able to optimize critical care air transport to further reduce the footprint because we could empty out the hospitals with critical care in the air, at 40,000 feet, take them back to Ramstein and Launchstoel so that you didn't have to hold patients as long in theater. And, that allowed us, again, kind of things that we may not have in the future that we're now concerned about peer competition. And we have an Air Force Medical Service that was really optimized for air dominance. And so I think it really influenced the Air Force Medical Service that I practiced in the last 20 years. And it's now creating a challenge for me and my colleagues to ready the Air Force Medical Service, which was geared for air dominance, to be successful supporting the Air Force and the Space Force in competitive airspace where any base, even at home, may not be a sanctuary.
So one of the roles that you had during OIF and OEF was serving as Central Command Command Surgeon. What was a major medical challenge that you encountered in that role, and how did you handle it?
Yeah, Doug, there were many challenges. It was 2009 and 10 for me. So in 9, we were reducing forces in Iraq. And so the challenge was how much medical footprint and laydown could you reduce because we needed more support in Afghanistan. And at the end of 2009, that's when President Obama approved the surge. So 30,000 more troops were added to Afghanistan. And we were concerned that during withdrawal times that the risk goes up again, kind of early in a deployment and late in a deployment, frequently risk goes up. So to take some risk there. And then in Afghanistan, it was really preparing for more conflict and casualties in the southern and southwestern part of Afghanistan. So kind of one of my major jobs was to increase intra-theater aeromedical evacuation and then inter-theater from Afghanistan, either Bagram, Kandahar, to Germany. And during 2009, if you recall, that was when the H1N1 pandemic occurred. And so that was kind of a big issue. And even getting troops into theater, it was more of an issue of cases in the United States. And many of the Persian Gulf countries were resistant to allow Americans to come in. So we had to do a lot of things pre-testing to able to get the troops in. So there was that H1N1 thing. Some of the other things were, dealing again with casualties and getting them back to Germany. And in the spring of 2010, there was a previously dormant Icelandic volcano that exploded. The shorthand name is E15. And I can't pronounce the long name. There's a lot of vowels and consonants in there, but needless to say, the ash cloud closed off a lot of European airspace. And so our aeromedical evacuation planes, and the Brits for that matter, that would go from Afghanistan to Germany or to London, that airspace was closed out. And so we were dealing with a lot of casualties. And so the question was, where do we take them out of Afghanistan? And there was a debate between myself and our team and Air Mobility Command and Transcom. And my argument was the best place to go was the most competent hospital in the AOR, in my opinion, which was Balad. And so we flew casualties from Bagram, stopped at Balad, removed the casualties that were kind of needed another surgical relook, maybe another clean out, stabilize them, and then brought them over to Andrews and Walter Reed. And so, I mentioned before the air dominance. And so, the question was, why the heck would you bring patients into another war zone? Well, we had air dominance, and that was the best hospital and the best potential outcomes for the patients. And so we ended up doing that. It worked out, really well, because if we had gone to Qatar, which was where the thought was, it's safer to go there, we didn't have critical care there. We didn't have, surgeons, chest surgeons that could do a relook on somebody whose, condition was worsening. So those were kind of amongst several of the challenges. I guess the last thing I mentioned was I had the opportunity to work with a lot of outstanding medics. And one is a friend and USIS classmate of mine, Warren Dorlack. And Warren was the joint theater trauma surgeon at the time. And this was at a time where the data was showing early blood rather than crystalloid in trauma was making a difference. And so we had no technicians at the time that were able to carry blood. So Warren and several colleagues put together a protocol for PJs, the Air Force Pararescue Men, to carry blood. He brought it to the Committee on Trauma for Surgery, got it approved, and then I convinced ComUSAF sent, I think it was General Hostage at the time, to allow from a policy standpoint what we had clinically gotten approved. And so from that point forward in 2010, PJs were the first to ever carry blood out to the X, to the point of injury. And so I think that was a good thing as well.
JJ, kind of continuing along that, the Air Force medicine has been around 75 years. You haven't been around quite all of that time, but you've been around a significant part. Can you think about some of the pivotal moments or some of the innovations that Air Force medicine has brought that you might want to discuss?
Sure. I mean, I think, strategic aeromedical evacuation, certainly during my entire career and before that, I think, been a game changer. And some of my Army and Navy colleagues have highlighted how CCAT, along with strategic aeromedical evacuation, uh, as I mentioned earlier, allowed us to kind of reduce the medical footprint. So when I was at Wilford Hall in 1990 as a resident, we sent 1,000 medics from Wilford Hall to go to Little Rissington in England, which was a mothballed uh, Cold War type hospital, because we thought, we'd have thousands of casualties there. And back then, people were admitted to a rear echelon hospital and, had to recover enough to be discharged to a C9 Nightingale. There wasn't the concept of critical care air transport. So you needed giant hospitals for thousands of casualties to get completely better. You would never have thought of putting somebody on a plane that was just barely stabilized, never mind not even stable, that required critical care or some surgical interventions in the air. So I think that innovation of strategic aeromedical evacuation and CCAT really changed the way that we did in theater care. The question is, will we have to change again now in an environment where we don't have air dominance? I think there are, we now support the Space Force. The Mercury astronauts, back in the 50s and 60s, after they'd go through their mission, would get taken care of by Air Force medicine at Wilford Hall in San Antonio. We've had a long relationship with space medicine, and there are kind of many other clinical innovations over the time. Some of the neonatal ventilation, the baby bird ventilator, neonatal transport, and ECMO, even adult ECMO now, extracorporeal membrane oxygenation, is something that the Air Force Medical Service is really kind of the only strategic transport. So if you're dying in some part of the world and you've failed all conventional critical care, you're on 100% oxygen, and the only way is ECMO, and you don't have it there, the Air Force can go get you, hook you up to ECMO, fly you back to our partners at Brooke Army Medical Center, and between Air Force medics and Army medics at BAMC, we can save lives that, a decade ago, there was no way. And so this played out a lot during the COVID pandemic, where we would pick up DVs from around the world, bring them back, or even just young airmen or family members and bring them back. So I think a lot of interventions. There's, out in Afghanistan, Todd Rasmussen and I think it was Brian Eastridge, because of all of the trauma there, developed the Raboa, which was a device that compressed bleeding in the abdomen, that was non-compressible, vascular shunts. Yeah, so a lot of things that have become standard of practice in surgical care and trauma care, not just Air Force, but military medicine in general. And so I think there is a lot to be proud about our 75 years and the couple of 100 years that Army medicine and Navy medicine, have done as well.
One of the things that's fairly new in the Air Force is this concept of a medical command or a medical entity that has command authority, and that is now Air Force Medcom. How do you think that's going to change how Air Force medical operations and decision making is conducted? And can you share some insights on the next step for this command?
Sure. So AFMedCom is our, well, let me step back and say that, Army medicine has had a command medcom for about 50 years. Navy medicine has had a medical command bureau of medicine for like almost 150 years. And during the 75 years of Air Force medicine, our anniversary, our birth date is 1st of July, 1949. So we're 75. We've always worked for the line. And so a medical group at any base doesn't have a medical commander above them that then reports to the Surgeon General as a commander. They would work for a line commander on an installation, a pilot, a maintainer, a support person, and then for a numbered Air Force, and then a major command. Air Force medicine and the Surgeon General has had direct liaison authorized authority for readiness on behalf of the Secretary and now two service chiefs to influence, basically by dotted line, if you will, the practice of medicine and the outcomes for readiness out in the field. And so for various reasons, because of the changes in the military health system and the DHA taking over healthcare delivery, it exposed our different command system was not optimal to support both Air Force and Space Force missions and really to work with the DHA. So the DHA's clinical leader, instead of going to a couple of medical GOs that had oversight of Navy medicine and Army medicine and their couple of hundred MTFs, for the 75 Air Force MTFs, they had to go to like 75 pilots at 75 different places that didn't really understand medical nuances and how to run a healthcare system. And so, we briefed the chief of staff and the secretary because they weren't liking the outcomes under the new military health system and said, we'd like you to trust us to be the commanders of Air Force medicine. And so we've had that approved at the secretary level. We have not yet transferred one MTF over, though. And so the inter-command transfer, that's the next step, Doug. That's going to happen in February, first in the NCR, and then every other month we'll move over a MAGCOM. What's really important going forward for Air Force medicine is to build trust with the line. And that just because they're not going to rate us in the future does not mean that we do not have their back and have their mission. And so I think it's critically important that the line doesn't consider us a tenant on the base in the future that's kind of going rogue and just doing healthcare delivery. And that was really one of the fears of some of the line when we pitched the Air Force Medical Command, that, when you're trying to balance or prioritize healthcare delivery and readiness and mission support, there was a concern that if the medics were just running things, that we would focus solely on delivering healthcare for the DHA, focusing on the statutory benefit and forgetting about readiness and the mission. And so one of my jobs going forward is to make sure that down to where the rubber meets the road, we are, in lockstep with the line that we serve and meeting their missions.
JJ, you oversee a 6,044,000 person integrated health delivery system and readiness system. It's incredibly complicated. How do you approach the leadership and management to ensure excellence across that vast and very diverse system?
Well, thank you for that question. And probably a disclaimer right now. The the 6 billion of healthcare delivery is now almost entirely under the authority, direction, and control of the DHA. And so we've got about $500 million of medical readiness that is service retained, but the healthcare delivery dollars in the new military health system uh, is under the authority, direction, and control of the DHA. We do have 44,000 when you add in our reserve component, and then there's another 20,000 that's not in that number of Air National Guard. And I highlight that because the missions of today, it's always required, total force medics. But when you look at the challenges today, particularly out in Indo-PACOM, uh, you need everybody, all compos, active, guard, reserve. And so part of my approach is to make sure that the guard and reserve are more tied in with us, training, exercise, to make sure that if the nation needs us, that we're more interoperable, and that there would be no difference if there was a guard CCAT, a guard EMEDS, reserve CCAT, et cetera, or active duty. As far as an approach to leadership and management, I've been a John Carter. Dr. Carter is a Harvard guy, business, and wrote the book with the penguin on there, Leading Change. And it's really kind of a framework that I approach, organizations. And so, you start with a sense of urgency, uh, have a guiding coalition. And so we have a wonderful leadership team here, diverse, all the disciplines, officer, enlisted, civilian, come up with a clear vision that is not so complex that you couldn't say it in 1 minute in an elevator speech, and then communicate that vision. And what I find the biggest challenge, and what Cotter says why organizations trying to improve or change are less than successful, is that they don't effectively communicate it throughout the entire organization. It's one thing to get in your boardroom and your leadership team, everybody nodding north and south, but down in the clinics, at the plant floor, does everybody understand the mission and the vision and what you're trying to do in stand up AFMEDCOM, or change from a air dominance kind of medical system to a operationally relevant for peer competition going forward, that you need to support Air Force presentation. So I think that communication is really key. Additionally, focusing on the culture and not just the strategy, that the culture of the organization, I think, is key. Is it an enabling culture? There's going to be some stress, but not coercive kind of stress, and trying to make it as fun and safe of a place to come in to work every day, whether you're at the headquarters and intermediate command or out in the field, because that medical care, even on a best day in the U.S., is stressful, potentially dangerous. And so you want the culture to be strong and safe to get the best outcomes. I think, what I'm trying to do here is to generate some early wins to kind of sustain the momentum, because like the change for AFMEDCOM is going to take 3 to 5 years really to get through IOC to FOC in a more mature organization. As far as me specifically, I guess I would call myself a learning leader, and that I've tried to continue to read, to broaden my fund of knowledge. And there's a quote from Louis Pasteur that chance favors the prepared mind, and I think the more you can prepare and broaden your fund of knowledge, when the unknown challenge comes, you're in a little bit of a better position to adapt to that.
So we talked a little bit about communications. We talked about culture. Right now, as we sit here, the world is seemingly on fire. Lots of stuff going on: Russia, Ukraine, Middle East, China, all over. So, what kind of specific strategic medical plans are you spearheading right now to support future missions for the Air Force or Space Force?
For really my entire career, the majority of what we focused on, I would call joint force presentation requirements that, you know, O plans from various combatant commands required a roll three. We would have the EMEDS modular concept that you kind of with building blocks scale it up to a theater hospital. Critical care air transport, aeromedical evacuation, staging to kind of get patients ready to put on. So what we're planning for that side of the mission is how do you become more resilient? How do you for a potentially sea burn challenge environment, potentially threat rings that would be inside your whatever your main operating base is, harden it more. What if you can't get aeromedical evacuation in because you don't have air superiority? And so we're preparing for situations where we would have to hold longer. Uh, we're training all medics, administrative folks, maybe non purely clinicians, in basic medical things. That we're calling it Medic X, so that in a mass casualty, everybody could help with kind of basic skills that we used to teach more during the Cold War, but we kind of let lapse. Really preparing those historic missions for a different kind of environment. Now, the other thing that we're looking at now is how do we support Air Force force presentation? Historically, when a fighter wing or a bomber wing would deploy, they would bring a flight doc and a couple of medical technicians. We call them squadron medical elements they worked for the wing all along. They would take care of them, fly with them, and then deploy with them. And we didn't really have any other Air Force medical capability that was aligned with the line, that organized with them, trained with them, exercised with them, certified, and then deployed. And so for the last 3 years, Air Force Medicine has been working with the Air Force A3 on how do we support Air Force units of action that we're now calling deployable combat wings. How do we support them in contested airspace, like an Indo-PACOM type scenario? And so we've created role ones, which would be primary care, DNBI, return to duty, about 35 medics, where they would work for the line units, at our fighter bases back here in the state, or bomber bases, train with them, take care of them, and then deploy with them. So what we had the luxury to do during air dominance was what kind of the line would call crowdsourcing support, that we'd go to a sanctuary base in the Middle East, and you could bring a medical capability from some other base, and they didn't really know that unit. And so going into peer competition, we want the folks that are going to return pilots or fighter pilots, bomber pilots, that we want them to know them really well from their home base, deploy with them. And then similarly, we are training role twos that would fall in on that Air Force, at a main operating base if casualties started occurring, and and allow that role one to focus on helping the unit to win the war, get them back in flying, return to duty, and then that role two would stabilize the casualties and intersect with the en route care system, which were the joint force capabilities. So really kind of evolving the superiority, permissive environment, Air Force medical system to something that's ready for a non-permissive, potentially CBRNE environment, and then designing Air Force force presentation support in addition to the historic stuff. So no shortage of challenges.
JJ, you have had a distinguished career and served at all levels of leadership. For some of our young listeners, they like leadership lessons and things that we have learned. And do you have a few that you might want to share to some of our younger listeners?
I think the taking care of people in whatever organization you're in, because the people are going to be the ones that do the mission. I've picked up a lot of things over the years from leaders at various organizations, and I'll give you one from the fighter weapons school at Nellis. And these are the best of the best pilots that come in from all of the fighter squadrons over the Air Force, that they bring them in to make them the leaders and better. And this group of Top Gun pilots, the motto of their trainers and the school was be humble, approachable, and credible. And I think for leaders at all levels, and particularly in medicine, where some would say in the bad old days when General Murphy and I started in training, and there was this kind of thing, physicians are God, and would yell at students and throw instruments, and that the anti-enabling culture and more of a coercive culture, and really kind of toxic. And so I think it is very important to be humble, that if you're a leader, you've got to understand your organization and the risk there. And so if you're not approachable or you're cocky, then the people who are doing the mission for you or taking care of patients underneath you are unlikely to tell you when there are problems and things that could go better. And that a patient or a mission, there might be harm. So being humble and approachable, I think, is key. Also being credible. You've got to walk the walk in addition to talking the talk. And I think, people are much more likely to follow you as a leader. One of the things that I've learned also as I've gotten a little more senior is, as a medical leader, we have to realize when we're speaking with the line, like when I'm talking to the Secretary of the Air Force or the Air Education and Training Command, the Vice Chief, whomever, is that I'm not talking to a physician and I'm not defending my thesis. I need to distill the medical things into, why should they care? What does it mean to them? And so making your best medical advice operationally relevant, I think, is absolutely critical. And so I give you an example. We're fighting through COVID, and I'm at Air Education Training Command, which has the only basic training in the Air Force and the home of pilot training. And so we're learning, along with the Centers for Disease Control, this novel coronavirus and how to act with it, and putting out medical advice. But we weren't exactly telling the BMT leadership and the 19th Air Force, who runs pilot training, how do you keep doing that mission with coronavirus? And so I think it's really important for us as medical leaders to interpret the medical data, give our best medical advice, and try to give the risk benefit and advice to the line leadership for how they may be able to get their mission done and help them make the best, risk-based decisions.
Yeah, I think one of the exciting things that we see today is that technology is just rapidly evolving. We have AI, unmanned aerial vehicles, wearables. How would you say that Air Force medicine is integrating these new medical technologies and information systems to improve operational readiness as well as healthcare delivery and patient outcomes for service members and their families?
So I think it's a team effort. We unlike like our Army colleagues, we have not had a gigantic multi-billion-dollar research enterprise, but we have two really, I think, accomplished research-focused wings. The 711th Human Performance Wing, which is out at Wright-Patterson, and they focus on operational research and things that kind of help the Air Force primarily, but they're also beginning to work with Space Force better. Kind of what's the next G suit, to help a pilot kind of maintain consciousness flying, at 9 Gs. And one of the things specifically to medicine, they've developed with the 711th, which is now in field testing, is a thing called BATDOC, BATDOK, and it's a handheld Android device that is compatible with 100 plus sensors that could be on a soldier, sailor, airman, and you get patient data on this in a handheld cell phone, ruggedized kind of thing that can be used in a COM-degraded environment. And you could put in joint trauma protocols in that to kind of give a combat medic 68 whiskey or a PJ, some standalone help. At the 59th Medical Wing, they do more clinical research. So what's the next best equipment package to go with critical care air transport? Now that's clinical research, and under the new military health system, it falls under the authority, direction, and control of the DHA. So it's DHP as opposed to the 711th Line Wing. So those are our two main thrusts, with clinical and operational focus. Up at the headquarters, we have a chief scientist that is involved in working with sister services, with OSD on finding grant money and going after kind of the latest advances that we can translate to future Air Force medicine.
JJ, that DC environment is incredibly complex, and you work at that highest level of the organization. How do you navigate that and then advocate for the health and readiness of airmen and guardians and their families?
Advocating for health and readiness for airmen and families right now is a unity of effort kind of organization, which is the military health system. So it is a partnership between the service SGs and service uniformed medics and the Defense Health Agency. And I say unity of effort because we're not a command. So, when you sit at the senior military medical advisory council with health affairs at the head of the table, DHA, the 3 service surgeon generals, and the joint staff surgeon, there's challenges because there's not one person that can kind of order things like a commander might. There's a significant authority with the Assistant Secretary of Defense for Health Affairs, and service surgeon generals have Title 10 that they execute on behalf, and the DHA has their congressional, mandate and authority. But sometimes the services focus primarily on readiness to the exclusion of having medics in the DHA's MTFs. And sometimes the DHA is focused on business case analysis for, delivering the strongest benefit that is statutorily determined, and they don't control all of the personnel that deliver that healthcare. They do control the civilians, but they don't control the uniforms. And so there's a real challenge with trying to do readiness and healthcare delivery, and that is kind of still that was a challenge 30 years ago, and it's a challenge today. And I think if you envision the quadruple aim, the DHA has the triple aim for healthcare delivery. The services have readiness, and the best way to be successful at that is for us to all work together in a supporting relationship. And so that is really what I'm trying to push to continue to be a really good partner for the DHA as far as healthcare delivery, but not at the risk of not fully supporting the service. So I think that partnership is key to supporting the line and supporting healthcare delivery. I think working together is really important, and we just had a senior meeting on that, briefing the SecDef on how do we stabilize the healthcare system, which is short several $1 billion going forward, and so it's going to take continued cooperation.
So when the history books are written 50, 100 years from now, how would you want your legacy in military medicine to be recorded? And if somehow your great-great-grandkids unearth this podcast 100 years from now, what would you want them to know about you?
As far as the history books, I would like it to view that the Air Force Medical Service was not reactionary, that it was proactive for the potential threats of the future, that we were not guilty of trying to fight the last war or support medical of the last war. Because we're perfectly configured right now for an air dominance environment when you can have on-demand air evac, CCAT, and basically be at a sanctuary base. We need to re-optimize for that, non-permissive environment that is peer competition and requires agile combat medical employment like the line needs to be. I'd like the outcomes to be better. And so clinical outcomes that those we serve feel like that healthcare is still one of the main reasons why they stay in the Air Force. There is a large retention and recruiting issue for all services right now. And historically, one of the things that kept airmen, sailors, soldiers, Marines is that we took care of them and their families. And I would want, 50 years from now that people would still stay in because the military health system was still, the place to get care. And I think, we're very expensive, but we are never going to be as efficient as Kaiser. We are the HMO that goes to war. And, I'd like us to be able to deliver great outcomes clinically and on the battlefields of the future, but with a certain amount of efficiency, because the more money that you have to throw at our capability, the less that you have for planes, ships, tanks, what's primarily supporting and defending the Constitution. So I think a combination of efficiency and effectiveness that is ready for the challenges of the future I'd be very happy with that, and it's almost easier to say what I wouldn't want, which is that we were not prepared, that we were not ready for the future, and that we did not deliver for the line, so much so that in a decade they said, you're too expensive, we're outsourcing you, and we're going to go with some version of Blackwater medicine. That's all contracted, and everything else is sold off to the lowest bidder. Because I think there is tremendous value in military medicine. We are going through a huge change, but I think we are a tremendous value to the military and the country, and so not just as an airman and taking care of Air Force and Space Force, but I think as a key stakeholder in the military health system, making sure that it survives and thrives into the future is really important to me.
How about the great grandkids? What would you want them to know about?
That's a hard one, Doug. I mean, is that I hope that that they know that their great grandfather cared deeply about the Air Force and wants to leave the freedoms that I've enjoyed with them going forward by keeping the greatest Air Force and Space Force in the world number one. And that if you'd allow me one story. So when I'm at Langley 15 years ago, there's a chief master sergeant who's being moved to a new duty station. And the moving company was from Hampton Roads, but they had some day laborers that some had emigrated from the Baltics. And so in 2007, we were becoming fully operationally capable with the F-22. And so a couple of F-22s do a combat takeoff, and it is really loud on the Langley air patch. And these guys who are moving, this chief's duck under the truck because they think they're being bombed. And so you can never take for granted air superiority. So I hope my grandkids never have to duck when they hear a loud noise, because that means that we are no longer, excuse me, the number one Air Force in the world. And so while I don't fly the planes, I support them. And that's really what I hope, because that is key to freedom going forward.
Well, we've been speaking with Air Force and Space Force Surgeon General, Lieutenant General Dr. John J. DeGoes on WarDocs podcast. Sir, thanks for sharing your experiences and insights with us, and thank you for your service. We wish you the best in this role as Surgeon General.
Thank you, and I appreciate what you're doing, sharing the stories of my colleagues, and it was a privilege to tell you some of my war stories.
Thank you for listening to WarDocs. We sure hope you enjoyed it. WarDocs is a nonprofit organization supported by donations from listeners like you. Please follow and subscribe to our show on whatever platform you consume your podcasts, and rate and review this episode, and share the show with your contacts on social media. Find out more information about our show, our guests, and how to become a member of Team WarDocs on WarDocsPodcast.com. Thank you for your support. If you like war stories and medical drama, WarDocs has you covered. Spread the word.